We're going live. We are live. Super. Okay. So we'll just wait. Hello, everyone. Just wait and see. Wait for other people to join. Okay. So I don't think anyone's. Oh yeah. So we've got people joining. So that's great. Hello. Hi everyone. We'll just wait one more minute. Hiya. Hi Sophia. Hi everyone. Cool. Okay. Well, it's 7:30, so I think we can kick off if you're ready, Amy.
I'm ready.
Super. So welcome everybody to today's reflective practice on the theme of guilt, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. So I'll just start with introducing myself. I'm Anjalee Perera. I am the Disillusioned Medic. I left the NHS in 2015 to become a writer, a business consultant, and now a career coach for doctors. And I wanted to just create this space for real reflective practice, because I think we all recognise that even though our educational bodies require us to reflect as doctors, there is just that real sense that it is just lip service, that it's just a training mandatory requirement. And unfortunately as well, in recent years, especially after the Hadiza Bawa-Garba case, it does feel kind of dangerous to be truly authentic and vulnerable in that reflection. And obviously, whilst you can still talk to family, friends, and understanding colleagues about the way that you're feeling about work, in our increasingly hectic lives and schedules, there isn't really that space for the deep dive into the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual realities that are just so unique to our profession. So that's what I want to do today, and we're going to focus on this theme of guilt. Got a few more people joining. Hiya, hello everyone. So guilt is something that is incredibly common, as we all know, amongst the medical profession. I mean, I personally haven't had a single coach who has guilt at all. And for me personally as well, I had that crippling pit of your stomach guilty feeling when I was leaving medicine. And now recently it's reared its ugly head up again because my license has been reinstated with all of this COVID nonsense going on. And I've been trying to figure out what to do myself. So it is very familiar. And I'm joined tonight by Dr. Amrita Sen Mukherjee, who is a GP with a specialist interest in occupational health, wellbeing and positive psychology. So welcome, Amy, and thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Hi, Anjalee. Thank you for having me.
Just a quick note to everyone. So obviously this is a live stream and it's a public platform. So do feel free to share any experiences that you're comfortable with. Feel free to ask questions, but just be mindful of sharing any sensitive information or anything you'd rather keep private. However, if you do want to share anything confidential with us afterwards, we will share our contact details with you at the end of the broadcast so you can get in touch. So let's dive in. Guilt. It's a common feeling before this crisis happened amongst doctors, but now in this era of COVID-19, we are seeing it take particular forms. So what I'd like to start with is perhaps Amy and I will talk a little bit about the forms of guilt that we are seeing amongst doctors at the moment. And in the chat, maybe you guys can share with us what you're seeing either in yourself or your colleagues and friends. So an example that I've heard and seen a lot from people is doctors who are self-isolating, quarantining at the moment and feeling guilty for not being there for their frontline colleagues. So that's a big one. I also heard from people who are beating themselves up really about not being enough in their eyes, faster, not being cleverer, not feeling so exhausted, and really wanting to help patients more and do more for as many people as possible, feeling guilty for not being a super person, basically. Certainly for me, very personal type of guilt is the retired doctors who are being called back, feeling bad for not coming back, or if we are coming back, feeling bad for not doing as much as we think we should. And also there are those doctors who were thinking about leaving before this all even started, who wanted to change profession. And that sense of wanting to leave is still there. But now in this crisis, when doctors are so critical and there's so much need, there's a sense of shame as well at wanting to leave. And another big one, one that was discussed actually on the Tea and Empathy Facebook group recently, was this sense of the public outpouring of support and generosity at the moment, freebies and offers of help, and gifts from the public. Doctors feeling like they really don't deserve it and feeling guilty for being given those gifts, feeling guilty for accepting them. So those are some of the things that I've been seeing. Ami, I think in our conversation yesterday, you were talking about doctors who are parents and have children at school age.
Yeah, so a few of the things that I've been reflecting on from conversations that I've had with my colleagues and with friends as well is the guilt, the human side of guilt, actually. So a lot of the things that you've discussed is the professional guilt, but actually the personal guilt that people are feeling. So actually, how are doctors managing their personal feelings about having parents in isolation? How are doctors feeling about having to go to work but leaving their children at school, if they're in a partnership where where their spouse or their partner is a key worker or in fact a healthcare professional as well. So all the other children in the school are staying at home in the comfort of their own homes and being protected and safe, but actually key workers are having to go out to do their jobs, to risk their lives, obviously, because this is the climate that we're in at the moment, but their children are having to go to school. But to the children, the school isn't the safe comfort environment that it used to be. It's actually a very different environment because they don't have their usual teachers, they don't have their usual structure at school, they're not going to classes, it literally is just childcare. So there's quite a lot of guilt surrounding healthcare professionals and key workers at the moment on a personal level and not just professional level.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Does anyone else out there have any forms of guilt that they've seen at all in your experience? Please share in the chat what you're feeling at the moment, what other people on your departments and in your teams. Please share with us any other types of guilt that you are seeing. It is really interesting, the point that you brought up, Ami, about children, because I imagine doctors in that position are going to feel like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. I mean, what do you do? Do you stop working? Do you then sit at home with that guilt of not working, or do you leave your kids to their fate at school, which is basically childcare? It's not really school, and then feel guilty for being a bad parent in your eyes. So that's a real tough one.
It is. I think it is a really tough one. And I think what we all need to be accepting of is that everybody's journey in life is different. Everybody's personal circumstances are different, and everybody's decision-making capacity is different as well. And we just need to allow ourselves, key workers, healthcare professionals, to be human. And that means not casting judgment. It means giving ourselves compassion, but also extending that compassion to other people as well, because we all walk different paths, and it's important to understand that of our colleagues and of ourselves as well. So no decision is right and no decision is wrong. We all just come from different backgrounds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an incredibly personal element to it, really. I mean, I think one of the things I felt in that struggle, deciding whether to go back or not, was how other people going to judge me. But ultimately, is as you say, no one really knows what you're going through. No one knows what your personal circumstances are. Only you know that, and you don't have to share that with other people. You know, you don't have to justify why you're making the choices that you're making. At the end of the day, you have the right to make that choice that's best for you and for the people that you love, right?
Absolutely. And that's a really interesting point that you just made that I'd like to reflect on. It's about how others view us. And that comes from, so how others view us actually isn't so much about guilt, that's about shame. So that comes from the concept of locus of control. So we have things that we can control, which are our internal locus of control, that's within our sphere, and we have control over that. And then we have our external locus of control, so that's things that come into our lives, but actually we don't really have any control over that. There are those balls that are just happening in our air and happening in our lives, and we just have to deal with them as they're coming, but we don't actually have any control over them. And actually, shame is one of those emotions that we feel that actually is a result of the external factors that happen in our lives, whereas guilt is something that happens because of the internal factors. So it's just really interesting to think about separating those two emotions and thinking about how actually we process those emotions, because if we think about emotions and we acknowledge them, then we have a way of managing them, but actually just letting those emotions fester inside can lead to quite maladaptive behaviours, which isn't very helpful to anybody in any circumstance.
Mm-hmm. We've got a couple comments coming through. So Sophia says, I've heard many of my colleagues from community settings have been feeling guilty about working from home, even if they are still doing work, so mainly phone reviews. So that's a really interesting one. So the guilt around not being there on the front line and not putting yourself at risk, as we're seeing so many frontline workers are getting sick and even dying on the front line at the moment. So that guilt about working from home. And Hannah said, as someone who's left medicine, I regularly feel guilty and oftentimes selfish for choosing to leave medicine for the sake of my mental health. It feels irrational, but it's difficult to shake. That's an interesting one. So do we have any suggestions for working through those feelings? And so Amy, any reflections on either of those?
Could you just repeat what the second comment was about mental health, please?
So as someone who's left medicine, I regularly feel guilty and oftentimes selfish for choosing to leave medicine for the sake of my mental health. It feels irrational, but it's difficult to shake.
Sure. So I would say it's really important to think about the reasons as to why you left medicine. And as I was saying before, everybody has their own journey and everybody has their own reasons for making specific decisions. And we have to think about how well we cope when we're at work and how that impacts on us. And actually, it's not easy to go to work if you're not doing very well yourself. And actually, it's a really, really brave decision to look at yourself and look at how the factors in your life and how your job is affecting you, and whether that's a healthy reaction that's happening to you, or if you need to do something to support yourself. And to be able to make that brave decision and say, actually, what's happening to me in my current sphere, something that I've worked really, really hard for, has not been beneficial to me, and I'm going to take a step back to repair myself and to support myself moving forwards, I think is a really, really healthy behaviour. And I think a lot of people would say that as well. However, the fact that you put a lot of work into that is only going to make you feel guilty about that, because you're thinking about the time that you've spent becoming a doctor and the time that other people have spent investing in you as well. But you have to think about no skills are lost ever. And the journey that you have taken up to this point in your life is not a lost journey. It's just a different journey. And who's to say that the point that you're at in your life now is not a beautiful point, and you don't have a wonderful, flourishing journey ahead of you now? I think it's just really, really important to reflect on the fact that actually we are all so different, and no knowledge is ever wasted, no journey is ever wasted. We just all have our own footprints in the sand, and just because your footprints have taken a different destination, maybe it's the path that's not been so trodden, who's to say it's not as valid, who's to say it's not as important, and who's to say it's not as beautiful? We just have to have courage in that, and we just have to have courage in the fact that our journey is as important and as valuable as anybody else's, because as human beings we are all equal and we are all as important as each other. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you talk about this concept of waste. That's certainly something that I felt I've wasted my skills. But yeah, it's sort of discovering that you needed a level of self-confidence, a sense of self, even self-esteem, to have that courage, to have the ability to stand up and say, I've done the right thing for me, and other people's opinions aren't going to shake that. So yeah, that's interesting. Coming back to the point about colleagues from community settings feeling guilty about working from home, my reflection on that is that a lot of the kind of talk about, it's a very militaristic language that we're hearing at the moment around the COVID-19 crisis. We're hearing about the heroes of the front line, you know, going out to serve, and medics being redeployed to the bigger COVID hospitals, and all this kind of almost romanticizing being on the front line. And I think for doctors, I mean, I recognize this in myself a lot. There is this complex of wanting to be that person, wanting to be the hero, wanting to be there, and almost playing the martyr role of sort of self-sacrificial lamb, really. So I wonder if that is inherent with this point about people who are feeling guilty from working from home, even though they're playing this critical part in answering phone calls and perhaps doing one-on-one work. It still doesn't feel like they're doing enough because they're not on the front line.
Yes, I mean, it's very, very, very difficult because we don't know where anybody's guilt comes from, but we all feel guilt. And so I think the really important thing about guilt is acknowledging the feeling, and then learning how to manage the feeling, because it's only with acknowledging the feeling and then processing the feeling that we can learn to manage it, because without doing that, it becomes a maladaptive behavior. And it might be because somebody who's in that context is having to go to the hot hubs. It might be because the hot hubs are where a lot of the primary care clinicians are having to see unwell patients with respiratory problems, and they're having to wear full PPE. Or it might be because there's one member of staff that has to go to the GP premises a day to see the face-to-face patients. There's a lot of untold stories behind this, and why people might be feeling the guilt. But the important thing is to acknowledge where that guilt is coming from, and without trying to unpick that and unpack that and figure out what's the basis of that emotion, what's the background behind that emotion, it's very difficult to deal with that emotion. And I suppose this is where the title of this live stream comes in, the real reflective practice. Actually thinking about your emotions is really, really hard, and actually becoming truly reflective with yourself is a really, really hard thing to do, because often what we do is we have an emotion and we're just like, okay, we'll just deal with that later. Because as doctors, quite often what we do is we deal with things later because we don't have time to do that in our day-to-day roles at work. Whether we work in general practice, we're doing 10-minute consultations, or whether we're hospital doctors, we have to deal with patients, we have to deal with colleagues, we have so many interactions on a day-to-day basis. And we can't often put ourselves in that equation, because if we do, then we can't function properly in our roles as doctors or as healthcare professionals, whatever our role is. So quite often what we do is we put our emotions on the side and we say, actually, I'm going to deal with that later. But what happens is then we become conditioned into dealing with those emotions later. And then that becomes a maladaptive behavior where we don't actually know how to deal with those emotions later, because we don't actually have the time to come back to them. It's not that we don't want to, we just don't have the time to. So I think allowing yourself the time is really important.
It's really interesting that you make that point, actually, because on one level it's an appropriate behavior. I mean, we can't bring our emotions into the equation. We're trained out of that, so that we can function, you know, in those situations face to face with patients. But the flip side of it is then it becomes an unhealthy behavior where we never allow ourselves to process those emotions, right?
Absolutely. And so the key is just finding the healthy balance.
So moving on to talking, you just mentioned a little bit now about the understanding the background behind that feeling of guilt and shame. So moving into that and exploring that a little bit more, something that both Amy and I discussed last night was this paper in JAMA from 2019 by a Dr. Lawrence Bloom, who is a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst, who specializes in treating physicians. And his paper was called Physicians, Goodness and Guilt, The Emotional Challenges of Practicing Medicine. And I'll pop a link to that in the show notes. So what he says in this paper is that dictionaries define the emotion of guilt as a feeling of having committed wrong or failed an obligation. Now, for doctors, by this definition of guilt, it would translate to things like medical mistakes, malpractice if you've missed something. But the crucial part here is that there is another definition of guilt, and one that we don't tend to talk about, which is a definition that doesn't actually involve any mistakes or any wrongdoing. And for doctors, what commonly tends to happen is that they feel guilty when they haven't actually done anything to invoke that feeling. So in all of the examples we talked about earlier, the doctor in question hadn't done anything bad, but they still took on that feeling of guilt. And the problem with that is then it becomes very difficult. As Ami was saying earlier, it becomes difficult to define that feeling. It is intangible. If you feel guilty because you've made a mistake, then obviously you can take steps to rectify that, right? You can try and make amends for the error. But when there was no mistake, the guilt is coming from a much deeper place. It's a muddier place. And therefore, it's much more difficult to get closure on that feeling. And the causes of that are very complicated. I mean, Ami will go into this more later, but it could be to do with your background, childhood experiences, your inherent beliefs about yourself and the world. And then it becomes very difficult to grapple with that feeling of guilt because, again, it is intangible. And the reason it's so important to grapple with it is because, as Ami said, we know that guilt can become unhealthy, right? It's the precursor to shame. If guilt is I did something bad, then shame is I am something bad. And then that can lead to toxic shame, which is when shame becomes so overwhelming that we experience that chronic and intense feeling of inadequacy, unworthiness, even of self-loathing. So it is critical for us to identify the roots of the guilt that we feel and to reckon with them. Just a couple more comments coming in. Someone told me once, you can't pour tea out of an empty teapot. And that really resonated and made me realize you have to take care of yourself first to be able to take care with others. I love that. That is fantastic. I've not heard that quote before, but I think, yeah, that's so true. So with that said, I'm going to hand over to Ami. So Ami, would you mind telling us a little bit more about why doctors experience guilt?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I suppose this goes back to our training and our education. And I just wanted to go back to initially talking about what guilt is, because in order to think about why doctors feel guilt differently, we have to really think about what guilt is. And it's a really complex emotion. And I think we all understand that because guilt can manifest in so many different types of ways. So we have primary emotions and we have secondary emotions. And primary emotions are those emotions that we feel in response to an event. And secondary emotions are those that we feel in response to the primary emotion. So, for example, and I'll give a really simple example, if one were to take the driving test or sit an exam and you were not to pass that exam or driving test, you'd feel a bit sad or a bit disappointed about it. But then a bit later on, you might feel a bit guilty about it because you might think, oh, I should have put more work in, I should have done more hours. Or if I didn't go to that party, then I would have done an extra hour of revising or blah, 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 blah. And then that's how the guilt comes in. And that's why you call it a secondary emotion. And then we have to think about how we as humans developed this feeling of guilt. And the social and psychological theories theorize that actually it stems from empathy. And so when we see somebody hurt or in pain or needing something, we want to go and help them. And so we do. But if we can't help them, or if we don't help them, that kind of gives us a funny feeling in our tummy, and that feeling is guilt. And so the belief is that we have developed this mechanism to try to promote humans to have more pro-social behaviours, so that we do act in kind or compassionate ways for the betterment of society, for the betterment of us, for the betterment of mankind. So going back to the complex emotion and to the definition that you gave earlier on, of guilt. Guilt is the feeling that you have compromised your own standard or your own conduct. And when we think about then doctors and doctors' guilt, why is it that doctors feel this guilt? Well, actually marrying these two concepts, and the concept of your own conduct and marrying the concept of empathy and guilt arising from empathy. Is it that you feel guilty? And this is just a question that I'm putting out there to people to reflect upon. I was thinking about it today. Is it that we as doctors feel guilt because actually we somehow are compromising standards? Is it standards that we have for ourselves, or is it standards that we are working towards because society or because others have set those standards for us? Is there a congruency in the feelings that we have because they are our own standards, therefore we're working to our own belief system, we're working towards our own identity and our own values, and therefore that's okay. We might not be meeting those standards, but our own motivations are the drivers behind those behaviours? Or is it that actually there's somebody else's motivators? Are they extrinsic motivators? Are we working towards somebody else's ideal, somebody else's value system, which unfortunately quite a lot of doctors find themselves doing? Because actually what happens is, in medicine, we have our heads down and we're working because we have an end point. We have to get somewhere, whether it be CCT, whether it be Caesar, whether it be a lap job, whatever it is that our goal is, we have somewhere to get to. And quite often, some people that I have spoken to somewhere along the line have found that actually somewhere along the line, their own identity or their own values have got a little bit pushed to the side because they're working to somebody else's song sheet. And that might be one of the drivers behind Dr. Guilt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I was really struck by what you said about it being a personal standard, because that ties so much for me with the fact that doctors tend to be extremely high achieving people. We have very high standards for ourselves. We're high achievers, we're perfectionistic. The expectations that we put on our own shoulders, and the level of criticism that we have for ourselves is very, very high. And therefore, does that play a little bit into being more at risk of feeling guilty, do you think?
Oh, absolutely, I think it does. I think it absolutely does. We can be our own worst enemy. A lot of doctors are very high achievers, and in order to get into medical school in the first place, you have to have very high grades, you have to have completed XYZ extracurricular activities. I know that it's different now, and I know that they're trying to change the entrance requirements to medicine. So I know that it's very different to how it used to be, say, 10 years ago. But still, for those doctors who are going through the system and not the new medical school graduates now, it was a very different way, and it was a very different mentality that they had to go through. And essentially, some people did have to jump through hoops in order to get get into medical school. And then once in medical school, they did have to continue on that track of keeping on, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, personally, I can attest to it. I personally have felt guilty and then taken that feeling to another level, and it's become a vicious cycle. It started to spiral with negative emotions. So I'm feeling guilty because of this, and therefore that makes me a bad person, and therefore all of this, criticism coming into it, all of this self-deprecation coming into it, and then it feels like having that higher standard for yourself that's almost unattainable, then contributes to that spiral, really.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why I was trying to say earlier on, I don't know if I was saying it well enough, that we have to allow ourselves to be human as well. Mm-hmm. And we have to allow ourselves the time to reflect on our emotions and to connect with our emotions and to figure out where these emotions are coming from. Because only when we connect with that feeling can we name that feeling. And if that feeling is guilt, or if that feeling is anger, or if that feeling is pain, or if that feeling is happiness, because we feel really great emotions as well, whatever that feeling is. And we should celebrate the positive emotions. quite often we dwell on the negative emotions, but it's really important to celebrate positivity as well, and that's key. So if you have a feeling, name that feeling to yourself and learn to manage that feeling. And one thing I want to say on that is positivity breeds positivity. So the more we train ourselves to acknowledge our positive thoughts, the more our mindset becomes tuned to those positive thoughts. And then our mind becomes a reservoir for them. And then that actually breeds positivity within ourselves, and we become more mindful of that. So if you can become more attuned to your positive thoughts, and you might find yourself becoming more positive.
Mm-hmm. I mean, another reflection that I had today was the sense of guilt coming from comparison. I mean, today we have access to so much comparison with social media. You know, you're constantly getting feedback from what other people are doing, and the sense of other people are doing better than I am. And in medicine, it struck me that there is just a constant level of comparison from day one of medical school. You know, a lot of medical schools grade you depending on how your whole year has done. So from that very beginning piece, you're being compared and contrasted against your peers. And then going forward in your career, because we're such a high achieving group in general, it strikes me that it's very easy to look at other doctors and say, they're doing this, they're doing that, they've got that clinical excellence award, they've, you know, spoken at this event or published this many papers or whatever. And when you're in a group of such high achievement, I think that feeling of not, for whatever reason, for feeling that you're not achieving that same level, I think that could also be a potential driver of guilt.
Yes, absolutely. And it's really difficult to know what the drivers are. But again, just having a look at our own selves and reflecting on our own emotions is really, really important. And I think it's really important to take a step back and look at your own strengths, because what person A might be really, really good at is public speaking or writing, and therefore they may get loads of accolades and, you know, be well known for X, Y, and Z. Person B might be really good at research. Person C might be a great clinician and really good at practical skills and putting in chest drains and whatever it is that they're great at. But we all have our own individual USPs, and we all are amazing at lots and lots of things. But finding out what your key strength is and focusing on that is really, really important. And that feeds into the growth mindset, and it feeds into actually being able to, and that's why I was talking about celebrating the positives and celebrating the good that we have in our lives. Because if we focus on the negatives, we get pulled into what we call a negative bias, and then we start to recall the negatives in our lives as well. And that can be very, very hard for us. It can be hard for our mindset. It can be hard in terms of self-esteem, and it can be hard in terms of anxiety and low mood as well. And it's really easy to think about what we're doing in comparison to other people. And that's human nature. I'm not saying that we all don't do it. Of course we do. We're all human beings. But I think if we find ourselves in that cycle of comparison, it might be worth reflecting on yourself and reflecting on what you're really good at, and looking at your own strengths and thinking, actually, they might have done this, but look at what I've done. And it might not be in a professional context. It might just be, sorry, there's no just in there. Let me take the just out of that sentence. It might be in your personal life, because personal life is as important as professional life as well. So it might be that you've, I don't know, climbed Mount Everest or Kilimanjaro, whatever it is. Obviously, no one would have done that in this climate, but you know, you might have had a personal achievement that other people haven't been able to accomplish. But it's really important to celebrate your achievements and be proud of your achievements, and not just look at what other people are achieving, because the grass is always green on the other side. And if you're always looking at what other people are doing, that will feed into your guilt as well. So try to reflect on yourself, acknowledge the feeling, and try to look for the positives is what I would hopefully suggest.
Yeah, a couple of comments come through. Chris says, I hate to say it, but there are 10 people who can replace you, but you don't have 10 different brains to replace your mental health. You are not weak for choosing your mental health. And then Hannah says, I think one of the problems is that general culture that's developed doesn't provide much of a space for these feelings to be expressed or worked through. So yeah, both of those comments really, really pertinent. I mean, I think the first one about not being weak for choosing your mental health, I think that is an incredibly difficult one for doctors. I think we as a profession, we really, really struggle with it. As much as we talk about our patients and our family members prioritizing their mental health and seeking help where they need it, it's very, very difficult for us to say that for ourselves, and it's valid. We have reasons for that are very, very pertinent and very true. If that sense of being judged by our community, and that sense of there being very high stakes, we could potentially lose our jobs. There's that fear of being pulled back, and there's all sorts of anxieties that go around stating that I have certain needs and that I'm not able to do the things that I want to do right now. That there's all sorts of anxieties about the implications of that, and I think that feeds into this wider sense of guilt, and particularly if we go back to the sense of the Hadiza Bawa-Garba case, this sense of if we are human, then we will be punished. That's an incredibly scary kind of concept to reckon with, and when you're living in that space all the time, I think it can provoke a lot of anxiety and drive that guilt as opposed to appeasing it.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to thank, I'm sorry I didn't catch the name, but it doesn't matter. I just wanted to thank the colleague of ours who has spoken about that, because it's absolutely right. It's really important for us to acknowledge that mental health is as important as physical health. And we all need to be afforded the right to be human beings, and we all need to be afforded the right to have feelings and emotions and be able to deal with that. And in kind of trying to link that to the second comment, you're absolutely right. We don't have the space, and it's easier said than done. And I'm sorry if it feels as if some of the comments are flippant and not taking into account the undue pressure that everybody's under in this working environment, because it wasn't meant to do that. You're absolutely right. There is limited space. There's limited bandwidth, but we're all working in very, very difficult circumstances, and we're all working very tricky times. And if anyone is having any difficulties with mental health, please reach out. There are excellent services out there. There's the Practitioner Health Programme, who are very, very excellent at supporting. And if you'd like to reach out to Anjalee and myself at the end, we'd be more than happy to support you. So absolutely, we are aware of difficulties, and colleagues of mine, friends of mine have also experienced those difficulties, and we stand in solidarity with our colleagues who are having physical health problems and mental health problems.
Mm-hmm. Chris says, I like that, Amy. Something I try to do myself every day now with a gratitude diary. Yeah, that's a beautiful thing to do, and a lovely way to allow yourself the space to reflect, and to have that space to work through those feelings. That's something that I found so difficult in medicine. The fact that as highly trained as you are, and as much as we talk about mental and emotional health in the sense of treating other people with it, not having that space there was something that was really difficult for me personally, and having to carve that space out for myself was something that I did end up doing, and it was wonderful, but it was something I only did after I left medicine, and when I discovered the importance of all that, when I discovered ways of doing it. I think when I was a doctor, I kind of looked at all of that stuff as kind of hippy-dippy nonsense. I'll be honest, I really did, because I think that's the way that it is portrayed within medicine, and certainly amongst the doctor community, there is a sense of kind of macho, you got to be a certain way, you got to act, behave a certain way, and so we don't grapple with these things. We don't have good resources. We don't have the space to do that, and so it saddens me in a way that I only discovered this after leaving medicine, because I think discovering it as a doctor would have been deeply, deeply beneficial for me, and I'm sure for other people too.
Anjalee, I just wanted to touch on that point, that you mentioned time is a limitation. There is something that is quite similar to the gratitude diary, which is called 3 Best Things. So it has a similar type of effect that the gratitude diary does in terms of improving people's gratitude and fostering positive emotion. But all it is essentially writing down 3 things that happened in somebody's day, rather than having to go into the whole, pros of writing down what you're grateful for. So if people don't have time, but they feel inclined to want to do something to just capture the positivity in their day, then they can just do something called 3 Best Things. So if you were to Google 3 Best Things, PPI, which stands for Positive Psychology Intervention, you might find some information on that, which might be helpful for people.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, I'll check that out. So we're coming to the end of our session. So I'd like to close with a reflective exercise that we can use to help us understand and reckon with feelings of guilt, particularly if you're finding yourself consumed by that crippling guilt. Now, this exercise is called the Emotions Court. It's a 5-step practice, and essentially we're going to take that feeling of guilt on trial. This is a way of detaching yourself from the feeling and looking at it objectively, thereby seeing it from different perspectives and diminishing its power over you. So what we're going to do is we are acting as the judge, the jury, the prosecution, and the defense regarding this feeling of guilt. And Amy, it would be great to have you do this with me if you're happy to do that.
Okay.
Fantastic. So the first step is to define the crime. So let's choose an example for this practice. Perhaps, shall we say, a doctor who's feeling guilty for receiving free meals from a local restaurant. Okay, so we've now defined that crime. So that's really important to define that guilty feeling. What is it that's driving that feeling? The second step is the prosecution. We're going to act as the barrister here for the prosecution. So what we're going to try to do is to justify that feeling and to clearly state in our argument why this feeling is valid. So I'm the doctor who is receiving these free meals. So justifying that feeling, I would feel like this is not something that this restaurant is doing normally. They're only doing it because these are extraordinary times. They're probably struggling. We've heard about restaurant staff being laid off, and we've heard about food having to be thrown away and cafes, bars, restaurants closing. So I would feel guilty that they're doing this for me when they're in so much trouble themselves. And any points that you have, Amy, about that? Anything that you can think of as an argument?
From the barrister side, no. I mean, I was thinking along the same things. Like, and also, I suppose for me, if it were me personally, I'd feel I'm not worthy of this. Mm-hmm. I haven't done anything to deserve that. Mm-hmm. Gratitude. I haven't done anything that's good enough to deserve a free meal. Mm-hmm.
And I suppose with some of the suggestions earlier about certain people doing more than others, perhaps it might be a case of I don't feel like I'm on the front line that much. I feel like, I'm a radiologist, perhaps. I'm twiddling my thumbs a bit because all of my lists have been cancelled. Why am I getting a free meal? Okay, so the third step is the defense. So now we're going to try to argue the opposite case. What could be the reasons that this feeling is not valid? So the first thing that comes to my mind in this case is that the restaurant owner who is doing this is potentially not about me. They don't have anything to do right now. They aren't running their restaurant. They aren't able to practice their normal business. They feel compelled to do something. And they want to help. This is a situation that's affecting everybody, and they don't want to just be sitting at home not doing anything. So potentially, I need to take myself out of this equation and say perhaps this is more about them wanting to do something than me deserving this or needing this.
Yeah, and equally, I would say that everyone is equal. We're all human beings. So whether you're a support worker, whether you're a key worker, whether you're a parent staying at home, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a doctor, whether you're a pharmacist, whatever your role is, whether you're a stay-at-home mum, stay-at-home dad, everybody has a role in this crisis, whether that be staying at home with your children and keeping them safe, whether that be delivering milk to people, whether that be working in a care home, whether that be working on the front line, whether that be working in a radiology lab. Everybody has a role, and everybody has to is fulfilling that role, not has to. Everybody is fulfilling their role to the best of their ability. So I would say everybody's human and deserves it.
Mm-hmm. And another point that just came into my mind is that we don't often get freebies. We don't often get treated to things in our jobs as doctors. In fact, the opposite often happens. We often have to pay for a very expensive parking. We've had a pay freeze for a number of years with austerity measures. There are lots and lots of facts that we could state to say that we're not freeloaders. There are plenty of facts that we could state to say that we are not freeloaders and that we're not taking advantage of anyone here. So this is a generosity, and accepting a generosity is an act of kindness within itself, really. That's another argument that I would make. So the fourth step is the jury. So we now need to look at the case before us as if we were impartial observers. So we put ourselves in their shoes, the impartial observer, and think about what they would say about this case. So what immediately comes to my mind as the impartial observer is, why is this an issue? If I was a layperson looking at this and seeing someone present somebody else with a meal who they feel grateful to, as an impartial observer, I would perhaps be a little confused about why this person is feeling guilty for accepting that. Because from an outside perspective, it seems just like a nice thing to do. So yeah, that's my perspective on it. What about you, Amy?
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add on that one.
Yeah, okay. So let's move on to the fifth and the final step, which is judgment. We are asking ourselves, in the light of all the evidence, what are our final conclusions? So just reflecting on that for myself, I'm feeling like, having looked at all of this case, I feel like for this particular person, if I was them, that feeling of guilt is more coming from that sense of not deserving, of not being worthy, than it is really coming from the actual act itself of receiving a free meal. That's the kind of conclusion I'm personally drawing. And perhaps that probably says something about me. I don't know if you feel anything different, Amy.
No, absolutely. And I think, therefore, I would take it a step back and think, where is that feeling of unworthiness coming from?
Mm-hmm.
I want to reflect on that personally.
Mm-hmm.
But then that is difficult in these times. We don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the headspace, and we are all being challenged in ways and means that we could never have imagined. And so I think that we're all doing our best and trying our best is amazing. And I think we all need to be easy on ourselves and just, give ourselves a break at this time, because I think everyone's doing a great job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I suppose by stating that it's my feeling of unworthiness that is driving the guilt, as opposed to the actual act itself, even if I don't have the time or the bandwidth to process that now, it's a step towards processing that emotion in a deeper way, I suppose.
Yes, absolutely. The first step is always connecting with the feeling and then naming it before you can acknowledge it to manage it.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. And thank you so much, Amy, as well, for being my guest. This has been a fantastic discussion and I've really enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed it too.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for inviting me on.
Fabulous. So I hope you guys have all found this useful. You can find us on Twitter. Amy's handle is @yourwellbeingdoctor, and you can email her at amrita@yourwellbeing.doctor. I'll pop all these details in the show notes as well when I post this online, so they're all available to you all. If you'd like to get in touch with me, my handle is @Disillusioned Med. I'm on Twitter and Facebook, same handle. Check out my blog at the disillusionedmedic.com, and if you'd like to get in touch via email, I'm at Dr Anjalee Perera @gmail.com. Thank you so much, guys, for joining us. And we got a comment saying Very insightful, very useful, fantastic. Would we consider doing any more of these in the future if possible? I think we certainly would. Would you, Amy?
Absolutely. Why don't, if you wanted to suggest a topic, I'd be more than happy to talk about it and discuss it. I'm talking to the audience, sorry. If the audience wants to suggest a topic, more than happy to talk about whatever you guys would like to hear. And I just, if it was helpful, it'd be really great to hear that. And if it wasn't helpful, it would also be really great to hear that, so that we can just support you further.
Fabulous. So if you guys could tweet us your feedback, positive or negative, we want to hear all of it. And also tweet us topics for what you'd like to hear us cover next, what would be most useful for you. That would be absolutely fantastic. And we'll definitely organise some more of these sessions in the future. So thank you so much, guys, and take care, and happy Monday, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye.